All of them have their fingerprints on that 17 years of failure, and all of them are committed to independence, which I think, it's no surprise that as a Scottish Conservative and Unionist representing the party across Scotland, I think independence would be the worst thing we could inflict on Scotland at this point in time.
Let's welcome to the podcast Craig Hoy, Scottish Conservative MSP and indeed Chairman of the Scottish Conservatives. Craig, hello.
Good afternoon.
Welcome to the podcast. Great to see you. Right then, is this a Conservative victory?
I think it absolutely is a Conservative victory. When Humza decided to kick the Greens out of government last week, we looked at the parliamentary arithmetic and realised that a vote of no confidence in him personally had a fair chance of succeeding. And once the Greens rode in behind us, I think it was inevitable that the First Minister jumped today before he was pushed by Parliament and the Scottish Conservatives this week.
In terms of what you want to happen next, then, what is that? What would mean another Conservative victory as far as you're concerned?
Well, look, our focus now shifts. Having met our objective was to remove Humza Yousaf from office. We'd said that we thought his period in government had been pretty chaotic, but it had also been deeply damaging to Scotland. I mean, there was a number of policy U-turns, a number of policy failures, and there was a number of scandals that could have been far better handled by the First Minister. I mean, had he taken action against Michael Matheson, we would have had a Health Secretary who'd been focused on dealing with the NHS winter crisis rather than focusing on saving their own skin. So I think the last 12 months have been chaotic. We're pleased we've moved on from that. I think I'm pleased personally that the Greens are out of government because I think they were pushing the country in the wrong direction. And now, my focus turns to the general election because in seats right across Scotland from the northeast to the southwest, there are seats in Scotland where it's a street fight between ourselves and the SNP, and having removed Humza, it would be good to remove the SNP from those constituencies.
Let me pick you up on that, Craig, because I think that's something that I'd really keen to kind of tease out from you. Humza Yousaf, Central Belt MSP, obviously originally, and then was moved to Dundee, but very urban. We're now dealing with John Swinney, potentially, as First Minister. I think that's most likely now, who's a Perthshire MSP. There is the potential for Kate Forbes to be part of that government. We'll wait and see. She's a Highlands MSP. Does that not threaten the Conservative Party a lot more in these seats that you just mentioned, in the rural areas in the northeast of Scotland, perhaps into Perthshire and indeed the borders? So perhaps through this, have you not shot yourself in the foot?
No, Geoff, I don't think we have, because I think there are two combined forces at play here. One is that the SNP's pretty appalling performance in public services and management of the Scottish economy and the Scottish tax system over the last 17 years. Those chickens have come home to roost, and let's not forget John Swinney was party to a lot of those decisions and those policies. And I think the other thing is, in those seats where we are in contention against the SNP, where it is a straight fight, look at last week, we had a by-election in Arbroath, where our vote was up 10%, the SNP were down 7%. I think the biggest swing in a council by-election this Parliament. And I think that what that talks to is that Scots in those areas are sick and tired of the SNP's record in office, but also they want us to move on from the constitutional division that the SNP are repeatedly sowing. And I think, if Humza Yousaf was continuity Sturgeon phase 1, then I'm afraid to say if it was John Swinney, he'd be continuity Sturgeon phase 2, because he was alongside Nicola Sturgeon when she took all those big decisions. He voted for the gender recognition reforms that are deeply unpopular in many parts of Scotland. And Kate Forbes was finance minister when Scotland's councils were starved of resources, and we started to create that disparity in the tax system between Scotland and the rest of the UK. So I don't think you can turn around and say, if it's either of those candidates, somehow there's going to be a challenge to us in those areas where we're fighting the SNP, because we'll point out their record and we'll point out that they are still as hell-bent on independence as they ever have been.
Continuity Mark II coming to billboards.
I heard somebody describe it as...
They're giving the election strategy away there, Craig.
I heard someone describe it earlier as continuity cubed. If you want that, Craig, you can have that one.
Well,
But can I just...
That's all right, that.
Can I pick you up on that, though?
Because Andy knows there are people far smarter than me that will come up with our messaging. But fundamentally... In those areas where it's a straight fight between ours and the SNP, I don't think much will change. We'll continue to point out the electoral dynamic in those seats, which is that if you want to defeat the SNP you vote Scottish Conservative and Unionist.
Yeah, I'm just quite intrigued by your sort of definition. You're defining John Swinney and Kate Forbes almost as, I think, unless I've misunderstood, as continuity-typed people because they've been involved in government in the past. And I'm just confused about whether you're mixing up continuity with experience.
Well, they have experience of being in government with the SNP, but if you look at all the key fundamentals, roads, railways, schools, hospitals, jobs, competitiveness, the sluggishness of the Scottish economy, the fact that tax is higher here in Scotland than the rest of the UK, and public service outcomes in many respects are poorer. Look at long waits in the NHS. We're just not shifting the dial on those waits of more than 2 years. Nicola Sturgeon, John Swinney, Humza, Yousaf, Kate Forbes all sat around the cabinet table that failed to tackle the NHS recovery post the COVID pandemic. So all of them have their fingerprints on that 17 years of failure, and all of them are committed to independence, which I think, it's no surprise that as a Scottish Conservative and Unionist representing the party across Scotland, I think independence would be the worst thing we could inflict on Scotland at this point in time.
Look, I know a little bit about the centre-right in Scotland, although most Scottish Tories think I know nothing about the centre-right in Scotland, but that's for a different podcast. Kate Forbes is the Scottish...
I want to know Craig's answer to that particular question.
That's going to be off the pod.
We've talked about that privately.
Craig and I have talked about that many times privately. That's fine. Kate Forbes is the Scottish Tories' worst nightmare. Right, let's just be honest about that. She's absolutely the Scottish Tories' worst nightmare. If it's John Swinney backed up by Kate Forbes, that's a bit less of a nightmare. But your first question, Calum, was about is it a victory for the Tories? I think it's a double victory for the Tories this week. One deliberate and one accidental. The deliberate victory was that you have to give it to Douglas Ross. If it hadn't been for Douglas Ross and the initial vote of no confidence in Humza Yousaf, this course of events, it might have happened at some point, but this course of events would not have happened so quickly. It would not have happened today. So, you've got to give that to Douglas Ross. He did that. But I think that the Scottish Conservatives can count themselves pretty lucky that it hasn't resulted in the 28-day rule being applied and an election coming up. Because if there's one party that doesn't want an election for the Scottish Parliament, just as much as the SNP doesn't want an election for the Scottish Parliament, it's the Scottish Tories. 7, 8, 9 points down in the polls in a proportional representation system, probably as things stand, losing one MSP off every single list. I think the Scottish Tories have dodged a bullet by not having to go into an election. And so I think it's been a pretty good week for them, all in all. Got rid of the opponent, will get the credit for that, but doesn't have to go into an election process where they'll almost inevitably lose ground. And Craig agrees with that, don't you, Craig? I mean, come on.
No, I don't, Andy. I think people were saying the same on the eve of the May 2021 Holyrood election. Some people were saying to me, you'll be down between 15 and 25 seats.
Boris was polling at 45%. You just got rid of Richard Leonard. There was Annis was in the door for 5 minutes. It's not the same, Craig. Come on, you know that.
I think Andy, also if you look at the actual polls out there that we've had, those recent council by-elections, 4 or 5 where we have outperformed, on the basis that you're saying we're down X percentage in the polls and our votes actually risen. So, my view about it is, and I've been around this game a long time, both as a journalist and a politician, and I remember Bob Wooster saying to me, polls don't predict. Pollsters predict, journalists can predict, politicians can predict, but the polls are a snapshot at any given point in time, and there'll be a lot of water under the bridge between now and any Holyrood election. But even if the election was now, I think it depends on the campaign we fought, it depends on the strategy we deploy. But fundamentally, in 2021, despite the doomsayers and the naysayers, Douglas Ross managed to match Ruth Davidson's high water mark of 31 seats, and we polled more votes than we ever have done in the history of devolution. And that wasn't something that was predicted or projected, so I wouldn't take a basket of polls just now and try and extrapolate that into what may happen in a Holyrood election, be that next month or in
What is your prediction, Craig? But you're a journalist and a politician. Podcast, so join the pollsters, come on.
Therefore, we'll leave that one hanging there. But I think fundamentally, with the right campaign and the seats for the general election, I am pretty confident we can hold the seats that we have and possibly make some modest gains, because in those constituencies we're explaining to the electorate that it's a street fight between ourselves and the SNP. I'm not saying the SNP are out the game at all. They're down, but they're not out. But fundamentally, people in those constituencies are reflecting on 17 years of the SNP government, They're reflecting on the last 12 months. They're reflecting on the chaos that continues to engulf the SNP, including the police investigation into their finances. And they're concluding that the time's up for many SNP MPs across Scotland. And we'll be explaining in those seats that if you want to get rid of the SNP, it's a vote for the Scottish Conservative and Unionist candidate. That's what I was saying, for example, when I was in Gordon and Buchan with our excellent candidate Harriet Cross the other day. We're on the doorsteps. Yeah. People had seen the literature. They understand the context of the seat. They understand the context of the contest. And they're willing to vote Scottish Conservative and Unionist to stop the SNP in those constituencies.
Thank you so much for watching. Press subscribe and you'll get all the best videos offering insight on Scottish politics delivered straight to your feed. Press subscribe and stick around. And if you'd like to hear our conversations in full, open up your podcast app and search for Holyrood Sources.